As many of you have read on our website, Diego Marroquín Bitar is the inaugural Burson Foster North American Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Institute, where he has a major focus on USMCA. Prior to joining the Woodrow Wilson Center, he was the senior researcher at Brookings Institution, where he created the Brookings USMCA tracker and scorecard. He's a fellow of the U.S.-Mexico Foundation and has been a consultant with the Economist Intelligence Unit over the years. Today, his talk is about assessing key USMCA metrics and looking forward. So with that, Diego, I will give you the screen, and then Megan, if you can make sure that the view is on Diego, we're going to be in great shape. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Greg. I appreciate that a lot. And well, I want to thank everyone for joining the call today. Let me share my screen for a little bit. Can everyone see what I'm sharing now? Yes.
We got it.
Okay, perfect. So as Greg said, the main points that I want to make today are mostly about USMCA in general, but specifically about US-Mexico ties and how those impact US lives on a daily basis. The structure more or less of the conversation, but please feel free to send any questions my way. I will be happy to, we confirmed that we were going to take them at the end, but please, I think that's the most interesting part of the conversation when I get to answer those questions. More or less, the structure of the conversation is going to go this way. I want to set the tone of the conversation a little bit, providing some figures around how interdependent the Mexico and the U.S. economies are, how deep are our economic, cultural, and familiar ties. Then I'll jump into USMCA, talk about the new trade agreement, what it has improved upon its predecessor, NAFTA. What are the main risks? We're going to go over the review of USMCA. I'm going to talk about that in more detail later. And then just giving some conclusions on what's next for North America in 2025 and 2026. Just stop me if you have any questions. If there's 5 things that I want to leave here during the conversation are these. Number 1 is that the US and Mexico economies are deeply intertwined. There's no other relationship that impacts more lives in the US than the ties it has with Mexico. Number 2 is that the full implementation of the trade agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada is crucial for a seamless review of the agreement in 2026. Number 3 is that USMCA is really good for Mexico, Canada, and the US and their economies, but it is not an all-encompassing solution that the agreement needs an enabling environment. And when I talk about an enabling environment, I talk about a solid business environment. I talk about aligned regulation between the 3 countries, and I talk about sound public policy in the 3 countries. And that also needs involvement from society, academia, industries, and government. Number 4 is that the US and Mexico have a very functional day-to-day relationship, but they have enormous challenges to tackle. Inaction or looking for short-term political wins or trade isolationism will damage our economic prospects. And lastly, the positives around USMCA shine brightly, but there's a lot of work to do, and some of that work falls outside the scope of the agreement, and we need to do a lot to strengthen it. Just again, giving some numbers here, the US and Mexico have a unique geographical connection. We have almost 2,000 miles of a border. It may not be the largest border in the world, but it is by far the most dynamic border region in the world. You'll see throughout the presentation that I have figures highlighted in red and some highlighted in orange. Those are highlighted in red mean that there was an increase between 2022 and 2023. We're talking about really large figures, and they are still increasing. So that's why I wanted to highlight those figures that are still increasing. For example, we had 270 million border crossings from Mexico into the US, just one way, in 2023. That is 35% more than what we saw in 2021. More or less, we get almost 740,000 crossings daily into the US from Mexico. If we took the GDP from both sides of the border, that from the Mexican border states and from the US border states, we would have the third largest economy in the world. That is larger than Germany, India, the UK, and even Canada. If I'm going to mention some figures about Texas as well, because I think this is interesting for everyone on the call today, but almost a third of US goods enter through Texan ports. You'll see that the green bars here represent ports are closer to the Mexican border, while the red bars represent ports are closer to the Canadian border. Almost a third of all trade goes through Texan borders. And I mean, just look at the Laredo port in Texas. Almost 20% of all goods that enter into the US go through Laredo, Texas. It is really important. Even that means that the trade in goods between the US and Mexico is larger than the trade of goods between the US and Canada. But before we get into the specifics about our economic relationship, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our deep familiar ties between Mexico and the US. From 2000 and 2021, the Pew Research Center came up with a really interesting study highlighting the fact that the Mexican origin population, that is people that either are from Mexico or are from Mexican origin, they increased 79% in 20 years, and now they account for about 37.2 million people in the US. That is more than 10% of the US population. And out of those 37.2 million, 26% of those live in Texas. US-Mexico ties touch more US lives than any other country through trade, through our border, through tourism, through family bonds, and even illicit activities, as fentanyl, for example, immigration. And that's why the US-Mexico relation, it's called an intermestic relationship, where there's an international component, because we're talking about two sovereign countries, but there's also a domestic component where a country's domestic policies impact the other country directly. Just fun fact, 85% of US counties have at least one Mexican restaurant. In fact, 1 in 5 Texas restaurants in Texas serves Mexican food, compared to 1 in 10 in the US. 17% of the restaurants in Texas serve Mexican food. That's just another way to say how daily life in the US is shaped by its ties with Mexico. For example, you wake up, you make some breakfast. If you make a sandwich, the tomatoes were probably Mexican, the bread was probably Mexican. Then you go to your car and drive to work. It is very likely that the car that you're driving to work in was made between the US and Mexico and Canada as well. Then you go to your office, or even if you stay home, you're working from your computer, you use your monitor that was likely made in Mexico. And then if you're catching up with friends after work, you grab a beer, Modelo, probably Mexican, or a tequila, or even the guacamole you share, it's going to be Mexican. So all aspects of daily life in the US are shaped by the connections that it has with Mexico. The US and Mexico trade over $1.5 million per minute. If we speak for about 45 minutes, that means that while I spoke, but for the duration of my presentation, the US and Mexico would have traded over $70 million. 13 million US and Mexican jobs are supported by bilateral goods and services trade. In the end, Mexico is a reliable supplier of imports that enrich the lives of US consumers through quality, diversity, and affordable products. This is just going back to the restaurant piece. See how Mexican food has a really big footprint in Texas specifically. In fact, in 10 US counties, for example, Ochiltree County in Texas, 42% of all restaurants serve Mexican food. But let's go back to the economic piece of this thing. And this will tie up perfectly with USMCA. Again, Mexico is the US's top trading partner. It's its second largest export market behind Canada. It's its largest supplier of imports. It's the second largest agricultural export market. 7 out of 10 agricultural imports that we get in the US come from Mexico. And 31 states have Mexico as either their first, second, or third main export destination. If we looked at it from the Mexican perspective, these interconnectedness is even bigger. 83% of Mexican exports go to the US. 17 US exports go to Mexico. The rest go to the other parts of the world. In the case of Texas, this is 30% of Texan exports go to Mexico. And these growth in trade, as the graph shows, U.S.-Mexico trade in 2023 was 31% higher compared to 2019. That is, even before the pandemic, we've grown 31%. And this has been made possible through bilateral institutions such as the North American Leaders Summit, which reunites the Mexican president, the Canadian prime minister, and the U.S. president, the U.S. Mexico high-level economic dialogue, but most importantly, the USMCA. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about the differences between NAFTA and USMCA, but I just want to leave a few points here. NAFTA was USMCA's predecessor. USMCA, it is not that very much different from NAFTA. It is, in fact, a modernization of NAFTA. It was still a trilateral negotiation. It still provides certainty to investors. In the ways that it's different is, for example, it introduces more effective dispute resolution mechanisms. Back in the NAFTA days, whenever there was a trade dispute, any of the three countries could veto a panel member, and then those disputes would stall for years, even decades. That is no longer possible in USMCA. There's a pre-approved list of panelists, and there's a clear guideline and clear timeline as for dispute resolution. What's different again is that USMCA raised domestic content requirement rules for autos, for example. Back in the NAFTA days, for a vehicle to be considered as North American and receiving preferential tariff treatment, that vehicle needed to be 62.5% North American. And that number has risen to 75%. And the second largest difference is that USMCA has a sunset clause. And I'm going to stop and talk about the sunset clause in a little bit, but this is an opportunity to modernize the agreement, and it broke precedent in the world of trade agreements. Trade agreements don't usually have expiration dates or sunset clause, and USMCA was the first one to do just that. But if we look into the semantics, I think the main difference is that USMCA is not a free trade agreement as NAFTA was. NAFTA was a North American free trade agreement. USMCA is more of an agreement to better manage trade, to raise domestic production. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So what are the metrics behind USMCA success? The first one is trade. Then I want to talk about jobs, investment, and dispute resolution. This all comes from a really good report that Ambassador Anthony Wayne, former ambassador to the US in Mexico, and I wrote and we published last week. I encourage everyone to read it. It has really interesting figures and graphs. Some of them I'll show here. Again, Mexico is the largest trading partner for the US. Let me show you something real quick. I'm going to switch screens for 1 second and let me see. Just let me know if you're okay. This is a really interesting graph that shows how Mexico became the US's largest largest supplier. When China entered the WTO in 2001, it quickly surpassed Canada and Mexico, as we're seeing here. But Mexico kept providing more goods to the US. We'll see that when we get to 2020, when USMCA is signed, that's where Mexico quickly overtakes China. And that's where we are right now. Mexico trades way more with the US than what China trades currently. This is just another example. If we looked at exports again, you'll see that Texas here, for example, 30% of Texan exports go to Mexico. The green states are states that have Mexico as their top trading partner. The red states have Canada. When import, we look at imports, it's the same. Almost 40% of all imports, that is 4 out of 10 goods that Texas imports, come from Mexico. Here are some states that are still have China as their top trading partner, like Florida or Georgia. But Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, they all have Mexico as their top trading partner. Let me go back to the original presentation. Okay. So let's talk about trade. And let's look at this graph. Just when USMCA entered into force in 2020, when USMCA replaced NAFTA, we'll see a dramatic increase in intra-regional trade. That is trade between the US, Mexico, and Canada only. The US, Mexico, and Canada trade over $1.8 trillion a year. It's roughly $3.6 million per minute. Again, double-digit growth. For the first time since 2002, Mexico and Canada are the US's top trading partners. If we just looked at the first 4 months in 2024, US trade with Mexico and Canada was almost 200% higher than US trade with China. And interregional trade supports over 17 million jobs, a 32% increase compared to 2020. So that is the trade and the jobs component of USMCA. But if we looked at investment, for example, this graph is very telling. When USMCA was implemented in 2020, there was we had the pandemic, but still there was a dramatic increase in foreign direct investment. In fact, ever since USMCA was implemented, the US and Canada have emerged as the top global destinations for foreign direct investment in the world. The US attracted $311 billion and Canada $50 billion. If we just looked at new investments, what experts call greenfield investment in new ventures, in new facilities, in new factories, that investment has grown by 136% since USMCA was implemented. And if we just looked at the first 4 months of 2024, we already have close to 50% of all the investment that we received last year. Combined, the three countries account for a third of global GDP. I left Mexico on the side because I wanted to make a few points there. The first one is that Mexico attracted $37 billion in FDI. That was a record amount, but still Mexico lagged behind not only lagged behind like Canada or the US, but it lagged behind other Latin American countries like Brazil, as this graph shows. Only 13% of Mexico's FDI, that the investment that it attracted, came from new ventures, while 87% came from investors that had already presence in the country. And I wanted to make this point because it highlights some of the criticisms that Mexico has received over the past few years, especially when we talk about this nearshoring wave. It is very difficult for Mexico to attract new investment because there are barriers that prevent Mexico to reach its full potential. And finally, if we talk about dispute resolution, USMCA has a very robust track record when it comes to dispute resolution. There's been 7 state-to-state disputes ranging from issues like dairy trade, solar panels, automotive rules of origin, energy policies, agricultural trade. 7 out of those 7, 2 have been resolved already. 5 are in the panel stage. We'll hear more about those in the next few months. For example, the US and Canada have a dispute with Mexico regarding Mexico's agricultural trade policy, and a panel resolution is going to come out this fall. Again, USMCA has been able to solve disputes in a matter of months instead of years and decades as compared to NAFTA. That's solidifying investor confidence in the region. The other difference between NAFTA and USMCA is that USMCA has a labor chapter, which a strong enforcement mechanism called the Rapid Response Labor Mechanism. It can be applied to the 3 countries, but in fact, the initiation threshold is much higher for the US and Canada than it is for Mexico. We've seen 25 labor disputes so far. Every dispute has been in Mexico. 70% of those disputes have been in the auto sector. 21 of those 25 have been solved already, leading to significant increases in Mexican wages, in workers that were illegally terminated. They got their jobs back, and important trainings for employees and employers on their labor rights. And it has had a very important effect on Mexico's manufacturing employment specifically, because this mechanism has defined priority sectors, which is mainly Mexico's manufacturing, industry, mining, and services. Then, if we talk about the USMCA review in 2026, again, USMCA broke precedent by introducing this review. This was the result of a negotiation between the Trump administration and the Mexican and Canadian governments. The Trump administration originally wanted USMCA to have an expiration date. Some stakeholders from that time thought that NAFTA stalled and stagnated, and some of the concessions that were made during the NAFTA days had to be rebalanced. So the compromise was to create the sunset clause. And I think semantics here are also really important. This is a review clause, a sunset clause, not a renegotiation clause. The three countries, we are in 2024, we reached the 4-year mark. At the 6-year mark, that is in 2026, the three countries will sit down together and they'll have to confirm in writing whether they want to continue with USMCA or not. If they decide to continue, as the graph shows here, they will extend the agreement for another 16 years, and they'll sit down again in 6 years and do the same process again. In the review process, the three countries will sit down, will check USMCA's effectiveness to date, they'll come up with proposals, they'll consult with stakeholders in their own countries, private sector, academia, think tanks, see what can be improved, and what cannot be improved, what needs to change, for example. And then on the other scenario that, for example, we get to 2026 and one of the three countries decides not to extend USMCA, trade in North America would not be upended as some people think. In fact, if we get to an unsuccessful review in 2026 and USMCA expires after that, the US and Canada could revert back to their bilateral trade agreement from 1989. Mexico and Canada could trade using CTPP rules, or even the three countries could trade using the World Trade Organization rules. But let's go back to an unsuccessful review. As I said again, it would not end North American trade. It would actually trigger a process of yearly reviews, as you can see here in the graph. So if we fail to extend in 2026, we have another chance to extend in 2027, another in 2028, all the way to 2036. If we get to 2036 and the three countries are unable to get to a successful extension, that will be the scenario where USMCA ends. It is difficult, but it's still very, very real and very possible. So what are the risks for the USMCA review? The main one is USMCA compliance issues. There are two main things. The first one is the US approach to rules of origin, and the second one are constitutional reforms in Mexico. I'm going to talk about those in a second. And the second risk is the rise of China and how its expanding trade relationships with Mexico and Canada can reshape the future of USMCA and can negatively impact the review that I was just talking about. Let's talk about rules of origin dispute. This, we have to be mindful that almost a third of all trade in North America is in the auto industry. It is the beating heart of USMCA and North American trade. And that's why this dispute is so important. 2 years ago, there was a panel where where Mexico and Canada clashed with the US interpretation of rules of origin for autos. The United States has a stricter interpretation of how they count the amount of components that need to be North American for a vehicle to be considered, again, North American, and then get preferential tariff treatment under USMCA. The Mexican and Canadian interpretation is more flexible. So they clashed. They requested an expert panel. The expert panel sided with Mexico and Canada, but it's been almost 600 days since that panel decision was made public, and the US has not made any announcement showing how they are planning or how they're going to go back to full compliance on USMCA. And that is that's a worrying sign, because if any of the parties decides not to comply with the panel, it undermines confidence in the effectiveness of the agreement. And then you get to the 2026 review with one country not willing to commit to USMCA. That would be very dangerous. In fact, a really interesting study by the US International Trade Commission was saying that USMCA again, it has stricter rules of origin compared to NAFTA. And those stricter rules of origin, those stricter wage requirements, and it also has requirements for steel and aluminum that needs to be made in North America. They haven't had the effect that they expected. So those new requirements on USMCA have actually had marginal effects on US employment and car production. And what we're actually seeing in the ground is that some companies now that they have to comply with these requirements, they rather export auto parts to the US outside of USMCA. So instead of trying to raise the bar up to the 75% comply with the wage requirements, they just pay a 2.5 tariff and they export to the US. That number, it was only 1% of auto vehicle imports in the US was done outside USMCA. Now we are at 20%. And this 20% and the tariff, the most favored nation tariffs are going to be, I think, an important part of the review process in 2026. And then there's the AMLO reforms. AMLO, as you all know, is a very popular president in Mexico, perhaps the most popular president in Mexico's democratic history. He didn't have the congressional support that he wanted at last year, but after her predecessor's massive electoral victory, it looks like he'll have the constitution, the legislative mandate to make the constitution and to drastically change Mexico's institutions and laws. And among those changes, there are many that could disrupt the positive track record of USMCA. For example, a sweeping judicial reform that will change the way that judges, the judicial system works in Mexico. They are no longer going to be, they are no longer going to get their jobs based on their merits and experience. So we will jump to popular vote to choose our judges, both at the highest level at the Mexican Supreme Court, but also local judges. That would definitely impact rule of law in Mexico. But if we talked about USMCA specifically, as this really interesting study that the Wilson Center made with IMCO, a think tank in Mexico, for example, there is a proposal to eliminate autonomous regulators in competition, in telecommunications, and in energy. That clearly goes against the telecommunications chapter of USMCA, the competitions chapter of USMCA, the state-owned enterprises chapter of USMCA. There's another proposal to ban GMO corn. Mexico is the United States' top destination for corn exports, and a ban on GMO corn would violate USMCA's sanitary and phytosanitary measures. In fact, there is currently a panel about that very issue, and it is ongoing. So these things can potentially contradict USMCA and will risk a successful review in 2026. But then going back to the China piece, because I want us to finish in time so that I can take more questions. China has become an issue of bipartisan concern. There's this narrative that Mexico and Canada has become a leak entry point into the U.S. market, where Chinese firms will transship goods into the U.S. to avoid tariffs. That narrative, it is a narrative because the numbers, I'll show you some figures here. These concerns are mostly overblown, but in fact, I think they're pretty valid. But the solution, it will not be found in unilateral actions from the U.S. Congress or the next U.S. administration, but it will, in fact, it can be found in if the three countries sit together and work solutions around this challenge. I just want to show you. So this is what we hear in the media. This is the noise. It is very valid. This is Chinese investment in Mexico and has increased significantly in the past 20 years or so. In fact, in the past 4 years, Chinese investment in Mexico increased 300%. If we looked at the border states, Mexican border states with the U.S. and how Chinese investment has changed over the years in the same time period, some states have seen the Chinese, their share of Chinese FDI decrease. In fact, Baja California, Sonora, and Tamaulipas have seen, for example, Sonora saw a 56% decrease in Chinese FDI, but other places like Nuevo León and Coahuila saw a 2,000% increase, and Nuevo León and a 5,000% increase. We need to be monitoring these developments, but I don't think we should worry about those right now, because there's this thing about perspective. This is a very interesting graphic. You'll see here, this is US investment in Mexico, this is Canadian investment in Mexico, and all the way down, this is Chinese investment in Mexico. It has increased, as this graph shows you, but nevertheless, US investment is much, much larger than Chinese investment. Even Spanish investment in Mexico and German investment in Mexico is much, much larger. Let me go back to the presentation here. No. Let me go back to the presentation. Okay. The point that I'm trying to make here is that, yes, Chinese investment has increased in Mexico in the past few years. However, it has started from a very low base, as the graph shows, and it will never surpass US private sector investment. Just talking about the graphs that I showed you before, Chinese investment in Mexico from 2018 to 2023 was approximately $1.7 billion, while US investment was $207 billion. That is 121 times larger. If we looked at the vehicle sector, US investment in Mexico is 49 times larger than Chinese investment. And in fact, if we looked at the trade side, Mexico's trade with China has actually slowed down in 2023 and is currently below 2022 levels. There are good signs already that Mexico is working with the US and Canada is working with the US to alleviate some of these concerns. In fact, a few days ago, Mexico and the US announced a new cooperation mechanism so that steel imports are less impacted by the China factor. There are new melting requirements for for steel and aluminum that is traded in the region. Well, this graph I showed you already. This is another good example to put things into perspective. The blue line is US investment in Mexico, the green line is Canadian investment in Mexico, and the red line is Chinese investment in Mexico. Again, a very low base and much, much smaller compared to North American investment in the country. So what we should be focusing on now that USMCA is approaching its year number 5 and year number 6. Again, full implementation of USMCA and its panel decisions are key. There's been some talk in the US about potentially overhauling the Auto Rules of Origin panel decision, or even conditioning the USMCA review on the US not complying with the decision. And I think that would take us down the wrong path and would very much would poison the well for USMCA review in a couple of years. In fact, what we should be focusing on is, instead of talking about, for example, as President Trump has said in campaigns, that the US is thinking, well, if he became president, he would pursue a 10% tariff across the board for all countries, including USMCA countries. That action would violate USMCA. It would result in cost for consumers in the 3 countries. I think instead, Mexico, the US, and Canada should pursue solutions that align with USMCA and should work to present counteroffers to Chinese investment and trade in the region. For example, if the 3 countries sit down together and define what are the red lines for Chinese involvement in the region, what are the red lines that for national security interest for the US, for Mexico, and for Canada. For example, if the 3 countries decide that Chinese involvement in telecommunications infrastructure or in border infrastructure or in connected vehicles, for example, those pose threats for national security, they should be working on a North American approach around this issue. They should work on counteroffers for Chinese investment in those sectors. And just finishing up, again, USMCA has a very strong track record, and it shows that enhanced integration rather than trade fortification or narrow self-economic interest, those things are the are what propel economic growth in North America. And those things, the positives around USMCA they shine brightly, but there are other things that need to be happening in order for this positive momentum to continue. One is USMCA compliance, and then the other thing is enhanced cooperation on other issues that fall outside the scope of USMCA, like regulatory alignment, like labor mobility. Those things are really important, and we have only 2 more years to see if the 3 countries will rise to the challenge. And I will conclude by saying that national elections, as we saw in Mexico, can introduce policy reform proposals that can profoundly impact USMCA. We're seeing that in Mexico already. That can very much happen with the elections in the US this year and potentially with the elections in Canada. So we should be monitoring these, and we should, again, be clear that it is enhanced integration what creates more opportunities in the region. I'll stop there because I want to hear some questions.
Diego, thank you. Thank you very much. We will let folks raise their hands or enter their questions in the chat. And while they do that, just a couple. I mean, you hit a number of the things that I was going to ask about, and maybe we'll just try to dig a little deeper in some cases. But on a broad brush, what do you think the chances are that USMCA won't get renewed? Are you a betting man on this?
I think the chance, I said it is real. We could get to that scenario, but it will happen if it happens, it will happen until 2036. It is highly unlikely, but it would have a very big cost. I think the good things about USMCA are so evident that it would be very difficult or very irrational to not to renew the agreement. So I think the possibilities are low, but nevertheless are there and are very real.
Okay. And then just kind of following up, you mentioned some of the issues with the GMO corn and so forth. What about things on the energy sector in particular?
Mm-hmm.
Are there issues there that could also create frictions or cause problems for the agreement, or just for that matter, trade relations?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say that is that Mexico in 2014 implemented a very big reform to the energy sector. For the first time in decades, Mexico opened its energy sector for private investment. And there was a lot of excitement and a lot of interest from US and Canadian companies. That reform, nevertheless, it's still there, but there were a series of administrative measures from the AMLO administration that started in 2018 that closed some of the channels for private or created some obstacles for private investment in the energy sector. And ever since that started happening, for example, some U.S. companies, some Texan companies have had issues like in getting their operating license to do their work in Mexico. So the U.S. government has complained for more than 2 years now. That process is under what they call technical consultations under USMCA. So it is not yet an official dispute. So there's not a panel yet. Some of those concerns have been addressed directly through the president of Mexico. So instead of going through the institutional channel of USMCA and addressing a dispute, what we've been observing is that some of the larger energy companies in Mexico, they go directly to the Palacio Nacional in Mexico City and they get their permits. That has worked for some companies, but I don't think it works for the overall investor confidence in Mexico. And at any point in time, that can become an official dispute that can lead to an official panel that could potentially lead to punitive tariffs on Mexican exports.
Excellent. I don't know if you can see the chat, but I've got it open on my side and can ask a question. Juan Villa is asking about thanking you for a great presentation, but then also asking you how you've been able to identify the true origin or destination of products that are registered as traded from Texas and/or California.
Well, in order to trade through USMCA, you need to show a lot of documentation for, like, you need to show that the good that you are exporting into that other country, it is free from forced labor, for example. If you're exporting a car, there are very strict requirements for, you need to show that the car was produced with high wage earning factories. Aluminum needs to be made in North America as well. So whenever you export something, whenever something crosses the border, there's a bunch of the documentation that can prove like where this product came from. And the thing about like US-Mexico trade is that we build things together, so we could like start with an engine in Mexico. They would send it back to the US. They would add more components to it. They would then come back to Mexico, and it slowly will become a car. Can become a car. So it is in fact feasible to identify the origin of these products. I mean, you have to look at customs data, but again, you can do it, and it is not that difficult.
Great. Question from Tom Long. In terms of the sunset clause, do you think there's a chilling effect on investment from the upcoming review? And then he mentioned, as you mentioned, the risk of overreacting to Chinese investment in Mexico. But what extent do you credit U.S.-China tensions as a cause for the growing nearshoring and investment coming from U.S., Canada, and so forth?
Definitely, because thank you, Tom. Investment decisions from companies are long-term bets that you don't invest in a country, you don't set up a facility. I mean, whenever you do that, you expect there to be a long time, because you want to be there for enough time in order to at least get your money back and then make some. So this was an issue for USMCA. Like if USMCA had an expiration date as it was originally proposed, it would be very bad for like long-term business decisions. So we came up with this compromise. USMCA, it is so we kept the investor confidence by creating this mechanism that will not upend trade immediately. There's many opportunities for the three countries to negotiate. In fact, if we can get to a solution in 2026, we have 10 more years of yearly reviews to find a solution. But even if let's think of that scenario, like we couldn't do it in 2026, so we're going to do it again in 2027, hoping that we find a solution then. Triggering this yearly process of reviews would definitely have a chilling effect of investment, because now you wouldn't be sure if you put money on a factory in Canada and the US and Mexico, you don't know if you're going to be able to take advantage of preferential tariff treatment through USMCA. So you would not end North American trade, but you would definitely stop this positive momentum that USMCA has built over the past 4 years. And then on the China piece, yes, if any country decides to take unilateral action on China, that would violate USMCA. For example, this proposal about a 10% tariff on all imports, regardless of whether they're from Mexico, the US, or Canada, that would violate the market access chapter of USMCA. And then if one country does that, you get to 2026, and then how can you give the other country incentives? How can you provide incentives to the other country to comply with the agreement if you're not doing the same? It takes two to tango. In the case of USMCA, it takes three. And again, as I said, the numbers do not support this narrative. But nevertheless, I think it is important for the US, Mexico, and Canada to closely monitor Chinese investment where they think it can become a national threat for national security, like border infrastructure, for example.
Good. Chap Lawson has a couple questions. One is, what is the roadmap, if any, for reforms in North America that would contribute to North American competitiveness apart from what's in the USMCA already?
Well, I think there are many things that can be done. For example, regulatory alignment. Some processes are very different in the US, Mexico, and Canada. I think Canada and the US have done a better job in In regulatory alignment, Mexico has some, it's lagging behind, and I think the three countries can work together to improve that. Another issue that was partially addressed through USMCA's labor mobility, for example, there are many vacant posts in both the US and in Canada. Actually, USMCA provides has a special visa for professional workers in the three countries to work, and it's easier to get that visa compared to a regular H-1B visa. But some of those vacancies can be filled if we have better labor mobility between the three countries. So those vacant jobs in, for example, the U.S. agricultural sector or the meat processing sectors can be filled if we do a better job on labor mobility. Another good example is energy. There are times where one of the three parties has like a larger demand for energy. And if we are better connected, if our grids are better connected, if our energy matrix is cleaner, is greener, we will be more resilient towards international shocks. So those things are outside the scope of USMCA, but are very much related to the success of the region in general.
Then a couple follow-ons from Chap. One is, as wages in Mexico rise, is there a provision for expanding USMCA to lower wage countries?
Well, currently USMCA only includes Mexico, the US, and Canada. Yeah. I think it's some people in Congress have talked about a possible USMCA expansion. I don't think that's not gonna happen. Definitely not now, not in 2026. It could be subject to conversation, but I think it is good when wages rise. But what we need to see in Mexico, in parallel, are productivity increases, and that's something that has stagnated for the past few years or so. Yeah.
Great. Okay. And then one last from Chap. What's the best way to counter the use of Mexico as a way for China to circumvent rules of origin and tariff?
Well, first of all, is putting things in perspective, as I tried to do. Then is sharing more information. For example, the U.S. and Mexico, I think last month, they announced that they were going to improve their monitoring mechanism for steel and aluminum imports. Then just last week they came up with this new. They're sharing more information. So whenever Mexico exports steel into the U.S., they have to show where it was melted, and if it was melted in like a nation like Iran or in China, then it would not get the same treatment as if it was melted in Mexico and Canada or even in Brazil that received an exception to that. So we need to share more data. I think and the next big thing is going to be forced labor, I think, because in USMCA, the three countries committed to basically eradicate forced labor in North American supply chains. And if you show documentation and if there's proof that the product that you made was made with forced labor or compulsory labor, that good is not going to be able to enter that other market. So I think we're gonna see companies and even consumers demanding more information on where their products are made. And if we find evidence that there's forced labor, there are basically you just won't be able to treat them in the region. So that's the next thing.
Okay, good. I saw just recently that two rather large carriers have expanded service lines between Shanghai, Busan, and then is it Lazaro Cardenas, a major port, which has got tremendously good access to both Mexico, but also then into North America. So we can expect that there's going to be competition. And I don't think that that's necessarily ever bad. It's just a matter of when it's unfair.
Exactly.
Okay.
Addressing unfair trade practices. And we have to be mindful. I forgot to say that, but Mexico and China, they do not necessarily have the best investment relationship. There's been multiple Chinese projects in Mexico that have been unsuccessful. There was an oil refinery in Sinopec oil refinery that never materialized. There's the Toluca Railway was a big investment from a Chinese company that also is having troubles to operate. So some of the issues that Mexico has in general as a country when it comes to rule of law and investment prohibitions, some of those issues as China has faced, but China does not have USMCA. So I think China is interested in Mexico because it's a way to de-risk their supply chains, as Canada and the US think the same way, but they don't have the same avenues as the North American counterparts have.
Great. And I've got a couple colleagues here that would like to just ask their own questions rather than have me filter them. So Chris, if you want to jump on.
Yeah, Diego, Chris Camardo here with CBTS. Thanks so much for the presentation. Yeah, great insight. I love the real-time charts, animations. Very easy to look at and pick through. I hope I'm not getting into the weeds too much in the weeds with this question, but are you able to outline any specific benefits or challenges that the USMCA has created for the pork industry in the US, Mexico, and Canada? And I'm coming at this a little bit from the standpoint, CBTS has several ongoing ASF projects.
Mm-hmm.
So
what do you mean by ASF? Sorry.
African swine fever, which directly affects the pork industry.
Well, opportunities, I think the sanitary and phytosanitary measures under USMCA were strengthened, and something specific about the pork industry, I will have to look at the numbers. We can talk about, I can give you my contact information, and then I could take a look at the pork industry specifically, but USMCA has a very strong track record when it comes to agricultural trade, and I would be happy to take a deeper look into that industry specifically.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, not to put you on the spot, but that'd be wonderful. Yeah, if we could connect after the call today.
It would be a pleasure.
Diego, one graphic that kind of really caught my eye was, and kind of tied with comments you made, that NAFTA was a free trade agreement and USMCA was more about managed trade, but then we saw this dramatic increase in trade, which you would have thought may have been more of a free trade opportunity. But why do you think that it accelerated with that USMCA?
Well, it has. So the thing is that USMCA does not exist in a vacuum, and a lot of things happen around USMCA. For example, we had COVID-19 pandemic, the US-China trade war that started a couple of years before USMCA entered into force, and all of these, and well, in more of on a macro level, I think there's this recognition in governments around the world that globalization is no longer about reducing costs and producing as effectively as possible. It's about creating resilient supply chains, being closer to your consumer bases. And these three things have really boosted interregional trade. And the great thing is that Mexico, the US, and Canada still have a trade agreement that allows them to take advantage of it. So I think those are the main reasons why, despite not being an agreement to liberalize trade specifically, it has been incredibly successful.
Okay. So we only have a couple minutes left. Want to open up anyone else that's got any questions? Give an opportunity for folks to just jump on or type into the chat if you wish. So we'll give that just an opportunity, because somebody may type as slow as I do, so it's only fair. But if as we wait for those last questions, if any, I want to just thank you, Diego. This was wonderful. Certainly, I was unaware of a number of the factors, and so I appreciate the way that you've tied things together. And certainly, I guess the other part is, which was still this issue on the renewal. If it's not renewed after the review in 26, it continues to be enforced with each subsequent review in the years going forward. Okay, so that was one that I didn't understand, and I appreciate that that kind of clarification for me in particular.
Yeah, no worries. I want to give everyone my email and my well, you can find me on LinkedIn if you just type in my name, but my Twitter account is good because I have graphs like that all the time. And I think they're pretty well. I think some people like them, so happy to share them there as well.
And then you mentioned the publication with Anthony Wayne.
Yes.
Could you send us a link on that as well? Just then we'll have that as a, we could share that with, I'm assuming that's coming out of the Wilson Center, or is it somewhere, another publication out of a different
No,
source?
it came out at the Wilson Center.
Okay.
I'll copy it.
If you can't get it in between now and then, I'll certainly be happy to make sure that it's part of
No.
our record. Okay.
Just found it here. Yeah, I would recommend everyone that take a look at, just skim through the report. It is very comprehensive. Most of the presentation that I gave today was based on this, and I think it's a good read, and it's an important read, especially now that we're at the 4-year mark. And in terms of trade, 2026 is like right around the corner, so we should really be thinking about those issues.
Wonderful. Well, Diego, thank you so much on behalf of CBTS. Certainly Tom Long as well, who has the yeoman's effort to get on LinkedIn here. But I do appreciate your time with us, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Just as a quick marketing opportunity, on the 30th, we'll have Undersecretary or Assistant Secretary, excuse me, Krista Brozowski coming to us, give a talk about some issues that are related to the new Supply Chain Resilience Center. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the week. Diego, thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias.